All right, what's going on, guys? So this is going to be a follow-up to the melee budget guide, and the main purpose of this is going to be to explain how you should go about upgrading your gear and your abilities, and then which gear sets and what you should prioritize, as well as an enhanced rotation for our new higher level setup. So first thing we're going to go over is there's two big branching pathways you can basically take, where you can either decide to delve into Slayer because melee is really good for Slayer, especially if you have a Noxious Scythe, or you can delve into bossing. I'm assuming that a lot of you guys want to get into bossing, which is why you're watching this video. You want to learn how to use melee. You don't just want to set up an AFK bar. So we're going to focus more on the bossing stuff, but I figured I would mention the Trimmed Masterwork, which is really, really good for melee, and then Noxious Scythe, which is really, really good for Slayer. Yeah, both of these upgrades are going to be massive for Slayer. Scythe does also have the upside of being good for pool skips if you're doing a lot of Raksha, but that's generally not something you have to worry a ton about. In terms of bossing, that's the only boss that you really use a Scythe for. So just keep that in mind before you end up buying one. The prices for all of this stuff is going to be on screen, so that will be, wherever it is. But yeah, basically, in terms of your armor and weapons, there aren't really any upgrades worth spending your money on until you get to the max gear, with the main exception being Abyssal Scourge. Basically, the way that Abyssal Scourge works is that if you're fighting an enemy where you can stack this all 50 times, which is going to be most bosses with, more than like 400k health, any boss where you can stack this 50 times is going to be really, really powerful. This is basically going to end up doing more damage than Leng's if you don't have access to your special attack, or if you're using your tier 85s. Consequently, this is essentially always stronger than your tier 85 main hand at any enemy that, again, has a lot of health. So on your way to get your main hand and offhand Leng, Abyssal Scourge is going to be probably the best item that you can get to just raw increase your damage. That's super, super good. Highly, highly recommend getting that. After you get your Abyssal Scourge, I would honestly not worry about gear until you get all of your melee abilities. Your abilities are just so much more impactful than your intermediary gear, where sure, you could get Anima Corvazaros or Torva or even Malevolent, but the reality is that those upgrades aren't that meaningful, and they delay your more powerful upgrade, which is going to be your melee abilities. So we're going to talk about all of your greater abilities and Chaos Roar now, but you want to get basically all four of these before you get any more gear once you get your Abyssal Scourge. Greater Fury is the best of these abilities. Greater Fury, which isn't to say that the rest of them are bad, but Greater Fury is just clearly the best. What this does is your next instance of melee damage is guaranteed to critically strike after Greater Fury. So what this means is that if you were to do a multi-hit move, the only thing that's going to crit is the initial next hit. So it's worse with, destroy and assault, better with overpower and like an Armandile Godsword spec. So very, very good. Generally, you're in your rotation, you will basically always want to Greater Fury, then overpower. If an enemy is lower than half health, you want a Greater Fury and punish. And once you have access to a good special attack, so either Dark Ice Shard or Leng's, you want a Greater Fury and then use Leng's if your overpower is on cooldown. That's more or less how you want to go about using it. Very, very good. You want to use it every single time it's off cooldown. Greater Barge, the clearing binds basically doesn't matter. There aren't that many bosses that will just root you in place and not also stun you. So if you get stunned, you would just free them, and then the whole clearing binds thing doesn't matter. What this does is when you haven't hit an enemy for a certain amount of time, or 4.8 seconds, your next channeled attack after Barge within 6 seconds will be dealt as a bleed. So what this means is that if you Greater Barge, you can do 2 abilities, and then your third ability has to be a channel attack. And if it is, it'll bleed. So any of the 3 abilities after a channel, you're all good there. Coincidentally, something that we can do is you can Barge an enemy, then you can Greater Fury and Overpower, and then you can do a channel ability, normally Assault because this is your strongest one. And then that is like the most possible burst damage that you can get off against an enemy. We Barge this enemy, Greater Fury, Overpower, Assault, and it's a lot of damage, right? We did 4 abilities and it was basically like 40,000 damage. So really, really, really good stuff there. This is the main way you want to be using your Greater Barge, especially at the beginning of rotations. Something that isn't like noted is that you are always keeping track of whether or not Greater Barge is up. So if you saw before I cast it the first time, there was no buff on my action bar. Basically, the way that Greater Barge works is as soon as you log into the game, 4.8 seconds after that, your Greater Barge is active, period. So one thing that we can do is, let's say we're starting a boss. As our engage onto a boss, you know, we can Greater Barge, like with the first kill of the boss, and then, you know, do the 3 abilities that we talked about. And then that's just a massive burst damage right at the beginning of a fight. So normally the way you're going to be using Greater Barge is right at the beginning of the fight and then not really any other time. However, there are instances where a boss will force you to stop hitting it. Carapac does this with the walk under to skip the time rift. Raksha kind of does this during Rockfall, where it's really not worth it to stand in one place for too long. So these are places where you're going to get multiple uses of Greater Barge, and I'll show a little bit of that in this video. But generally, it's just at the beginning of the fight. Also, it's good at like Virago, because at the beginning of each phase, you get a free Greater Barge, right? But this is how you use it. Whenever a boss forces you to stop, you just Greater Barge. Or there are going to be instances where you can put like a bleed on a boss to do a phase transition, and then you can Berserk, wait for Barge, and then do your Barge, Greater Fury, Overpower. That's what I usually do at Raksha. It's not particularly fast, but it's like the most condensed damage that you can get. So it has a lot of uses, and it has a lot of instances where you can use it, but the most common use case is you just started a boss fight, so you get a free Barge. Beyond that, we have Greater Flurry. So Greater Flurry, I don't believe this does additional damage over regular Flurry, but basically this just reduces the cooldown of your Berserk by 4.8 seconds. Notably, this is a channel, so you can use it with Greater Barge to lower your Berserk without committing to the channel. So we can Berserk, we can use a couple basics, and then once our Barge is active, we will Barge Flurry, and you'll see that our Berserk cooldown is lowering really fast. And that's just because of the Greater Flurry interaction. Being able to bleed your Flurry and still get the cooldown reduction, that is the primary use case for it. Otherwise, it's just another threshold to use if you've somehow gone through all of your thresholds. Generally, that's the only use for it, is you will use it once, maybe twice to get faster Berserks, and generally it's going to be bleeding it so that you're not committing to, you know, a low damage threshold. Last but not least, we have Chaos Roar. Just like with the Greater Fury, this basically will make your next instance of melee damage be 2x'd. It has kind of wonky interactions where if every hit of the ability is hitting on the same tick, then the whole thing will get duplicated. But for one of these channels, it'll only double the first hit. So if we want to Chaos Roar Overpower, both of these are going to be doubled. So you see it did 25k damage. However, if we Chaos Roar Assault, only the first hit is going to get doubled. So you see the first one was 6,000, the rest are around 3,000. So this is something else to keep in mind. Basically, you want to Chaos Roar as a second instance of Greater Fury, but you want to use it on like your massively high hitting moves. So the main use case that I use for it is I will Greater Fury and use Leng spec, or your Dark Ice Shard spec. I believe it doubles the entire spec. You can also use it with a Claw, Essence of Finality. Again, I believe it doubles the entire thing, but we can actually just check now. So here we'll do Claw, Essence of Finality. We see that did 3k, 1.8k, and then around 900. So now we'll Chaos Roar Claws. Okay, so it does double your entire claw spec, so that is massive. That's basically going to be the main use case of it. But if you don't have enough adrenaline for claws, then you can, or if you don't have an essence of finality, you can just Chaos Roar Leng spec, and that's just good enough. That's also very, very powerful. In your Berserk, you'll see that this does a pretty crazy amount of damage. So that's the main use for Chaos Roar. The other use for Chaos Roar is once you start getting all of your other gear, the last upgrade you're going to want to get is a Masterwork Spear of Annihilation. And this is because of the EZK spec. So the tzkal-zuk, what this special attack does is it puts a bleed on the enemy, and then that bleed will keep increasing its damage based on how many more bleeds you put on the enemy. What you can do is you can Chaos Roar, then EZK spec. What this does is it doubles the initial hit, and then that initial hit gets increased by 5% every single hit. So that is the other main use of Chaos Roar. Something to keep in mind is that if you don't have an EZK, then you just aren't going to have access to this interaction. So if you don't have an EZK, Chaos Roar Claws is really good. Chaos Roar Leng spec is really good. Like even with the tier 85s with no stacks, Chaos Roar Leng spec is still, what, 11k? That's not nothing. Once you get a meaningful amount of stacks, that damage goes way, way, way higher. So it's good stuff. It's good damage. Again, prices for this is going to be on screen as I'm talking about it. So just be aware that these abilities are fairly pricey, but they are honestly all better than any individual piece of gear that you can get. So once you have your Abyssal Scourge, and once you have all of your abilities, you're basically going to want to go straight into your Lengs. Your main hand Leng is probably going to give you more damage than all of Vestments combined, but Vestments are very, very good, and they are cheaper than main hand Leng. So that is worth keeping in mind. Something else to keep in mind is that Vestments opens you up to like really crazy adrenaline usage or really crazy damage rotations. So what Vestments does is it has a 4-piece bonus. With 2 pieces, your next ultimate generates 15 adrenaline over 18 seconds. If that is ticking and you use a second ultimate, you'll just generate 20 adrenaline instantly. Basically, this means that your Berserk is going to generate a little bit of adrenaline, and your overpower is going to be 20 less. So, good stuff. Also, your second overpower is going to generate 15 extra adrenaline because you can use it again outside of your Berserk. Next, your Berserk's duration is extended by 6 seconds. This is massive. Cannot understate how powerful this is. And then fourth, maximum adrenaline increased by 20 while using melee. Again, this is incredibly powerful. And you'll see how crazy our rotation can get once we have access to all of this. So let's put back on our tier 70 stuff, and we'll kind of show what a rotation is going to look like. So basically, once you have all of your greater abilities, you kind of can't use Greater Barge unless you have access to Limitless. Limitless is incredibly expensive. I believe this is like 800 or 900 mil. I don't recommend anyone really get it right now. It's just incredibly expensive, and it does essentially nothing for necromancy. And it is good, but you're basically paying one build to not use Vestments. So just use Vestments, right? So that's kind of the deal with Limitless. I have never used this with Vestments. Well, I guess I wouldn't say never. I've used it a couple times at Carapac. This is not crazy useful for melee, especially while you're learning. Once you get really comfortable with melee, this is something that you're going to use on the fly, or you're going to build rotations around it. For instance, you can use it at Carapac during a time warp to squeeze out a little bit more damage. So that's something to keep in mind. You can't really use Barge unless you use Vestments. And that's largely because if you wanted to do the Barge, Greater Fury, Overpower, Bleed Assault, you need a Limitless without Vestments. It does do a lot of damage, but again, you need a Limitless. So we'll just overload so we have a relatively accurate view of how much damage this is going to do. We'll click on this. And basically, you're going to Zerk and a Dren Pot, Barge, Greater Fury, Overpower, Limitless Assault, and then just use basics. And you see the damage here is really, really crazy. Then we're going to Chaos Roar, Weapon Spec. That did another 34k damage. And then that's pretty much all you have time for inside of your rotation. So that was a lot of damage there. But again, it doesn't showcase how crazy this setup actually gets. So now we're going to do the same thing, but the only thing we're changing is we're switching to Vestments. And you'll notice how much more adrenaline we actually have to play with and how crazy our damage output gets. So we're going to do exactly the same thing, except we don't have to use Limitless. And you'll notice our Berserk is lasting way longer and we have way more adrenaline. So here, same thing, Barge, Greater Fury, Overpower, Bleed Assault. We can Chaos Roar, use Weapon Spec. Now we can Greater Flurry. We have a ton of adrenaline. We can do one basic. We can destroy. Then we still have time for a Greater Fury and another basic. So we got 2 Greater Furies off. We got all 3 of our channels off. And we got our special attack off. We got literally all of our big cooldowns off. And that's just from having Vestments. On top of Vestments just giving us a way higher damage bonus. So honestly, I know I said earlier that main hand Leng is probably better than all Vestments, but I think this demonstration pretty clearly shows that going straight to Vestments is going to be the biggest bang for your buck. Once you get Vestments, you can get your main hand Leng. That's the obvious next upgrade you want to get here. Once you get your main hand Leng, this increases your proc chance of Primordial Ice from 6% from the main and offhand to 11%. This is good enough that you can basically skip the offhand Leng until last. Once you have your main hand Leng, again, pretty massive damage increase. The spec does the same damage, but you're operating with 8 more tiers of damage and, you know, more chance of getting Primordial Ice. Super, super good for obvious reasons. Once you get your main hand Leng, you're going to want to get a Champion's Ring. This is just more crit chance against bleeding targets. If you're using the Abyssal Armor Spikes, that's really good. And then more crit chance, more crit damage, super good. There's just nothing else to say about it. This is clearly the best in slot ring, so you're going to want to get this at some point. It is decently pricey, so keep that in mind, but it is something that you're going to want to get. You can get it before your main hand Leng if you wanted to. It doesn't matter a whole lot, but again, something to keep in mind. Once you have all of your armor, now we can start looking into Essence of Finalities. The first one you're going to want to get is Dragon Claws. The damage here is just really, really crazy. So we're going to do the rotation again, but we're going to Chaos Roar Claws, and it's just really insane damage. So here we Greater Barge, Greater Fury, Overpower, Assault, Chaos Roar, Claws, and our Claws did like 30,000 damage. And now we'll Greater Fury, use Leng spec, that did 24,000 damage, then we'll, use a destroy for a couple ticks. That is an absurd amount of damage, and you'll see when we do a Raksha kill later, it just gives you access to so much burst so fast that you can phase him very quickly. I've had kills where I've done the first phase of Raksha before he does tail swipe. So that's 200,000 damage in like 10 seconds. After you get claws, it's up to you what you want to get. Claws are going to be a lot better than Armadyl Godsword if you're going to use Berserk and if you're always going to Chaos Roar your claws. They're also going to be better than Armadyl Godsword if you're going to be doing a lot of switching and getting access to the crit adrenaline buff. Claws hit 4 times, AGS hits once, checks out. The math is there. However, if you're not using a crit buff, you're not using a Grimoire, Armadyl Godsword is actually going to be generally a little bit more damage just because of the way the damage roll works. So if we just do claws here, that was about 10,000 damage. And then if we AGS, that was the same damage, but one of the claw hits crit, so obviously that skews it a little bit. But yeah, your AGS is generally going to hit a tiny bit harder than your claws. However, because claws have more chances to crit, there is a chance that claws are just generally better, but there is a use for an Armadyl Godsword. So you can kind of pick which one of these you want to get. Basically, if you want to use a Grimoire, you get claws. If you don't want to use a Grimoire, you get an AGS. After that, you want access to a Statius Warhammer, depending on the bosses that you're doing. So if you're doing a lot of Virago, if you're doing AOD and you want a melee for whatever reason, any boss where you don't have 100% accuracy that you're camping, Statius Warhammer is pretty mandatory. Finally, you want to get a Masterwork Spear of Annihilation and an Essence of Finality with an tzkal-zuk. The reason you're getting this last is tzkal is like a bill. So to get access to your bleed setup, you're spending a bill on your EZK, or I think it's like 1.2. Spending 1.2 bill there. You're buying an Essence of Finality, which is another 240, and you're buying a Masterwork Spear. And unless you have all 3 of these, they all do nothing. Well, not nothing, but it's not really worth using a Masterwork Spear for, my Dismember's off cooldown, 1-tick switch to Spear, then switch back. You can do that. It's not worth it, in my opinion. It is something that you could do if you want to mega optimize damage. But once you get it, you do get access to something pretty powerful. So the way the bleed rotation works is you basically, after you do your Berserk rotation, you do a greater Flurry, then you put on your Spear, you Chaos Roar, you EZK spec, and then you just dump a bunch of bleeds onto the enemy. Now I'm just gonna equip the Scourge just so that I can put the 4th bleed on. But you see we got 5 extensions and this bleed is just gonna keep ticking up. So 4.2k, I believe this hits 14 times, 4.4k, 4.8k, 5.1. So yeah, that was 14 hits. So overall, our EZK did around 55 to 60,000 damage, and that's from 1 spec. So that's the main reason that you use your EZK is it's 1 ability, 2, I guess if you include Chaos Roar, but it's low commitment, 60,000 damage over time, not including the damage from all of the bleeds that you put on. It's super, super good. It's going to be some of your highest damage output while your Berserk is on cooldown. And it's the main thing that you're going to want to use when you're Berserking on cooldown. It's not super necessary, so that's why I suggest saving this for last, but it is clearly very, very good. Unfortunately, you have to EOF your EZK because it is a bleed, so because all we care about is the bleed duration and getting the most damage out of the bleed, casting your bleed with the Masterwork Spear is just better than actually casting it with an EZK. It's unfortunate, but that's what it is. Now, depending on how long the startup for a boss fight is, you actually get access to really interesting ways of starting fights. So that sounds vague, but basically what you can do is you can go to a boss like Raksha that has a short startup. You can Zerk at the adrenaline crystal and go into the fight with your berserk ticking down and use that to get a ton of damage out right in the beginning of the fight. So here we're actually going to show what that looks like. So the best way to do this is you want to go into Raksha and you want to start it so that you can quick join. So we'll start it. For the aura, we're using Berserk. It's just far and away the best aura. It's an incredible amount of damage, which you'll see. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to overload here. We'll activate darkness. We'll activate our scripture. We will Dragon Battle Axe, switch to our Lengs, and then hit the adrenaline crystal. After we hit 100 adrenaline, we're going to berserk, and then we're going to recharge back up to 100 adrenaline, and then instantly go in. So here, we'll spec, put on our Leng, Zerk. Once we're at 100, we're going to go in. Rejoin. So we're just going to do the exact rotation that we talked about before. I'm going to use a Vaughn Bomb here because you should use Vaughn Bombs. So Barge, Fury, Bleed Assault, use Leng spec, and we already phased him. Obviously, I got hit there. Don't do that. That's not good. We're going to hit him a few times. We're going to wait for our Barge. We'll Barge, bleed a Flurry. Now we'll do our easy K rotation. So we did Chaos Roar, easy K, then we're stacking all of the bleeds. Now we're just going to hit him with basics. So he is eventually going to like bleed pretty low here. So I'm going to do one attack and then I'm going to berserk. We'll Dren Pot. We'll Barge. Fury. Overpower. Bleed Assault. Use our weapon spec. Use Claws. And we're just going to do one more basic here. And it phases. So it wasn't a perfect pool skip, but you see the burst damage right in the beginning of the fight and the burst damage at the end of the fight was really massive. Again, it's an insane amount of damage. There's just no other way to say it. So here we're just damaging the boss, nothing crazy. So we'll escape here, just walk back in. Just using basics. I could have used an assault or destroy, but I just didn't really feel like it. So because we need to walk and pick up this anima anyways, we're going to Zerk and then wait for Barge. We Barge. We Greater Fury. We Overpower. I Limitless Assault here. It makes me sign. Don't do that. That was just ultra greedy. Didn't have to do that at all. Now we're just going to use basics for the rest of the fight. Use Greater Fury here. I think I use a Destroy. Oh no, I just use Punish. Then just use a couple basics and he will eventually die. Use a Claw spec at the end and that is a Raksha kill. Alright, and hopefully that was a pretty clear demonstration of how you can go about using melee at relatively high-end bosses. Obviously, I signed. That was because I got greedy and wanted to bleed and assault. Just don't do that. Super not necessary. Or be a little bit faster. If I was a tick faster, that would have been totally safe. But yeah, so hopefully this explanation kind of shows you what you can expect to get out of melee, as well as how you can use it in a practical scenario. But yeah, this video is going to be a little bit longer than what you guys are used to, but again, hopefully it helps. If you like the video, feel free to drop a like. If you like the content in general, feel free to subscribe. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.